Imagine standing beneath the blazing Egyptian sun, the desert heat wrapping around you like a suffocating cloak, with no shade and no breeze to bring relief. Before you towers the beginnings of a pyramid, its stone blocks rising higher each day, each one heavier than a car, hauled into place by nothing but sheer muscle, ropes, and determination. You grip a rope with calloused hands, your back already aching from endless days of labor, your body coated in dust, sweat dripping into your eyes. This was the daily life of the workers who built the pyramids, monuments that have stood for thousands of years. But at the time, they were simply the most grueling work sites on Earth. The truth is, most of us today wouldn't last a single day under such conditions. But what was it really like to work on these ancient wonders? How did the workers survive the heat, the hunger, and the relentless pressure of the task before them? Tonight, we're going to step back in time and walk among those laborers to explore the daily reality of pyramid building in ancient Egypt. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we tell long, detailed stories from history to help you drift off, especially if sleep doesn't come easy. If you enjoy relaxing with history at night, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future journeys into the past. And while you're here, let us know in the comments what topics you're most curious about, and when you like to listen, whether it's right before bed, in the middle of the night, or during a quiet afternoon. Your suggestions guide us in creating the stories you want to hear. So settle in, get comfortable, and allow the steady rhythm of history to carry you away. Tonight's story is not just about the pyramids as monuments, but about the people who built them, their lives, their struggles, and the reasons why it would be nearly impossible for most of us to endure what they faced. Let's begin our journey back to ancient Egypt, where the desert sun was unyielding, the work endless, and the monuments eternal. The story of the pyramids begins not with the workers who hauled stones or the architects who drew plans, but with the vision of a single ruler. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king. He was a living god, the earthly embodiment of divine power. His reign was seen as ordained by the gods, and his death was not considered an end, but a transition. The pyramid was the bridge between earthly life and eternal existence. To build a pyramid was to ensure that the pharaoh would reign forever, not only in memory, but in the spiritual world. Every block of stone placed was an act of devotion, a physical manifestation of the people's faith in their divine ruler. The pyramids were not simply tombs. They were cosmic statements, carefully aligned with the stars, their sides oriented to the cardinal points of the compass. To the Egyptians, these structures mirrored the order of the universe. They symbolized stability, balance, and the eternal cycle of life and death. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, was aligned with incredible precision, pointing to the north with an accuracy few modern buildings could achieve without advanced instruments. This was not an accident, but a demonstration of the pharaoh's role as mediator between heaven and earth. For the workers, however, the pharaoh's vision translated into decades of grueling labor. Imagine being summoned from your village, perhaps a farmer who normally spent the year tending to crops along the Nile. When the river flooded and fields were submerged, you were drafted into service at the pyramid site. You joined thousands of other farmers, artisans, carpenters, stonecutters, all pulled together under the mandate of royal authority. There was little choice in the matter. To refuse was to defy not only the pharaoh, but the gods themselves. The very foundation of Egyptian society was built on obedience to this divine ruler, and the pyramid was the ultimate test of that loyalty. The vision of the pharaoh was grand, but it was also practical. The construction of a pyramid required massive resources, and organizing such an effort had political benefits. By employing thousands of people, the pharaoh reinforced his control over the land. The pyramid project tied villages and regions together in a shared national endeavor, one that displayed Egypt's wealth, power, and unity. For the pharaoh, it was as much about politics and power as it was about religion and the afterlife. The sheer scale of the pyramids proclaimed to the world and to future generations that Egypt was a civilization unlike any other. But if you stood at the base of such a project as an ordinary laborer, the grandeur might have been lost on you. You would have seen endless lines of workers hauling ropes, dust clouds rising from quarries, and massive stones being dragged across the sand. The sound of pounding, chiseling, and shouted commands filled the air. Overseers barked orders, while scribes recorded deliveries of stone and tallied the work done each day. It was a hive of activity, buzzing with urgency, because the pharaoh's eternal house had to be completed before his death. Time was always pressing, even when the structure was meant to last forever. For many laborers, this vision may have felt distant. After all, it was not their tomb that was being built. But the pharaoh's divine status cast a long shadow. In Egyptian belief, the afterlife of the ruler directly affected the prosperity of the entire kingdom. If the pharaoh failed to reach the afterlife properly, the gods might abandon the land, crops could fail, and chaos might descend. To build the pyramid was to secure not just the king's eternity, but the stability of the entire world. Every stone laid down was a safeguard against disorder, a way to keep the cosmic balance intact. There is also the matter of pride. Workers were not faceless drones. They were human beings with identities, families, and ambitions. Evidence from the workers' village at Giza shows that many were well fed, housed in organized barracks, and even received medical care. They worked in rotating crews, each crew taking pride in the tasks assigned to them. Graffiti found in the pyramids bears names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a sense of camaraderie and even humor among the workers. To be part of such a project was to take part in history, to contribute to something larger than one's own life. Still, the gap between the pharaoh's vision and the workers' reality was immense. While the king dreamed of eternal glory, his laborers endured cracked hands, sunburned skin, aching backs, and the ever-present risk of injury. They lifted and dragged stones that weighed several tons each, often in blazing heat with only the simplest tools. Rest was minimal, demands were constant, and mistakes were not tolerated. The pharaoh's vision might have inspired awe, but it was also a heavy burden, carried on the shoulders of countless men and women whose names have long been forgotten. The enduring mystery of the pyramids lies partly in this balance, how an entire nation could rally behind one man's vision and translate it into stone. For modern observers, it is almost impossible to comprehend the scale of devotion and labor required. Yet for ancient Egyptians, this was the ultimate expression of order and loyalty. To live in Egypt was to exist under the gaze of the pharaoh, and to die was to hope that his eternal life would secure your own. The pyramid was not only his promise of immortality, but a shared promise to the entire kingdom. Standing at the foot of such a project, you might have marveled at its rising form, even as you dreaded the backbreaking work of hauling yet another block into place. The pharaoh's dream was becoming reality, one stone at a time, but each stone also carried the sweat and struggle of ordinary lives. It is here, at the intersection of divine vision and human endurance, that the story of the pyramids begins. The vision of the pharaoh could not be realized by dreams alone. To transform thousands of blocks of stone into the towering structure of a pyramid required the single most important resource in ancient Egypt: people. Without a vast workforce, no amount of stone or planning would matter. Yet the story of who built the pyramids is far more complex than the simple myths often told. For centuries, many imagined that the pyramids were built by legions of enslaved people, whipped and driven under merciless taskmasters. Hollywood films and old histories painted a picture of suffering masses toiling without choice. But the evidence tells a different story, one that is both more humane and more fascinating. The builders were not slaves in chains, but largely free Egyptians, recruited from across the Nile Valley. Most were farmers who were drafted into service during the flood season. Each year, When the Nile overflowed its banks and submerged the fields, farming became impossible. Instead of letting thousands of men sit idle, the state redirected their labor to massive public works. For 3 or 4 months, while their land lay underwater, these men would travel to pyramid sites to work. In this way, Egypt turned a natural pause in the agricultural cycle into a national construction season. But this seasonal workforce was only part of the picture. Alongside the farmers were full-time crews of skilled laborers, stonecutters, carpenters, and craftsmen. These specialists did not come and go with the floodwaters. They lived in the workers' villages year-round, maintaining continuity and expertise on the site. The most dangerous or technical tasks, like shaping massive granite blocks or positioning keystones, required training and precision. Without these experts, the labor of farmers would have been wasted effort. Organizing this workforce was a monumental task in itself. The numbers are staggering. Scholars estimate that tens of thousands of workers might have been employed on a single pyramid project. Imagine coordinating a small city with people arriving daily, food and water needing to be distributed, tools issued, shifts managed, and records kept. Ancient Egyptian administrators rose to the challenge with remarkable efficiency. Scribes kept detailed accounts, recording the movement of supplies and the output of each work crew. Overseers divided workers into manageable groups, often with their own names and identities, like the followers of Khufu or the boat crew of Menkaure. These names gave a sense of pride and unity, transforming grueling labor into a shared mission. For the workers, being drafted was not always a burden. While the work was undeniably hard, the pyramid projects offered steady rations, shelter, and in some cases, medical treatment. Evidence from Giza suggests that workers were fed meat, fish, bread, onions, and even beer foods that many peasants might not have enjoyed regularly in their village lives. In fact, the workers' diet seemed to have been richer than that of ordinary farmers, with animal bones found in abundance near the workers' barracks. To some, pyramid duty may have felt like an opportunity, a chance to earn favor, improve one's social standing, or simply enjoy food and company different from daily village life. Still, it was no gentle assignment. Draft notices were not optional, and refusal could bring punishment. The pharaoh's command was law, and when his officials came calling, you gathered your belongings and set off for the worksite. Families were disrupted, villages thinned, and the weight of labor fell heavily on those left behind. Women and children remained to tend what they could, while husbands, fathers, and sons marched off to the quarries and ramps. The diversity of the workforce was remarkable. Farmers rubbed shoulders with artisans, scribes with laborers, and cooks with builders. There were water carriers, bakers, brewers, tool makers, and rope weavers, each fulfilling a role in the vast machine of pyramid construction. Without bread and beer, the workers would have collapsed. Without ropes, no stone could be moved. Without carpenters, the sledges that dragged blocks across sand would have fallen apart. Every hand had a task, and every task was essential. It is also important to remember that the workers were organized into hierarchies. At the top stood high officials and architects, men close to the pharaoh, who supervised the entire project. Beneath them were overseers, each responsible for hundreds of men. Below them again were foremen, each commanding small teams. The lowest rank was the ordinary laborer, who spent his days pulling ropes, carrying loads, or hammering stone. This structure kept order, but it also ensured accountability. If a block was misplaced or a task delayed, someone could be blamed. The workforce was also tied together by ritual and religion. Before major tasks, offerings might be made to the gods, and prayers said for strength and safety. Workers were not simply building a tomb. They were part of a sacred act that united them with the divine. The pharaoh's vision was not just political but spiritual, and in Egypt, the line between the two was thin. To labor for the pharaoh was to labor for the gods themselves. This belief gave meaning to what otherwise might have felt like endless toil. Yet we should not romanticize their experience too much. The workers were flesh and blood, enduring blisters, exhaustion, and backbreaking tasks. Many were far from home, sleeping in crowded barracks with little privacy or rest. Discipline was strict, overseers demanding. Those who slowed down or faltered risked beatings or worse. The sense of pride may have softened the burden, but it did not erase it. Even so, the sheer organization of this workforce remains one of the most impressive feats of the ancient world. Consider the logistics. Tens of thousands of people fed daily, thousands of tools forged and repaired, and rivers of water hauled from the Nile. Each man had to be accounted for, his contribution noted, his absence explained. It was less like a work site and more like a military campaign, where discipline and coordination were the difference between success and disaster. And what a sight it must have been. As you approached the work site, you would have seen rivers of men flowing in and out, lines of workers pulling sledges, others chipping stone, and smoke rising from kitchens that baked bread and brewed beer. Overseers on raised platforms shouted orders, scribes marked tallies on papyrus, and the sound of chanting crews echoed against the desert hills. This was not chaos, but an organized spectacle, a testament to Egypt's ability to marshal its people for a single, enormous purpose. When we imagine the pyramids today, we see silent stone giants, but in their making, they were alive with human activity. Every block carried the touch of countless hands, every ramp soaked with sweat, every stone dragged forward by the force of hundreds of straining bodies. The workforce was the true engine of the pyramids, the living heart that made the pharaoh's vision possible. Without them, the desert would have remained bare, the pharaoh's dream nothing but words. It is easy to think of them as anonymous, faceless masses. But they were individuals, each with a story, each with moments of fear, exhaustion, or pride. Some returned home after the season's work, telling tales of the colossal stones they had helped move. Others stayed longer, becoming part of the permanent crews. Some fell ill or were injured, their bodies buried near the very monuments they helped create. Together, their lives and labor became the foundation of Egypt's enduring legacy. In the gathering of the workforce, we see both the scale of Egypt's ambition and the depth of its organization. The pyramids were not miracles of stone. They were miracles of people, united in purpose, drawn together from across the land to serve their pharaoh, their gods, and their nation. Imagine the moment you leave your village behind, stepping away from the narrow strip of fertile land by the Nile and walking toward the desert horizon. You have been called to serve, along with dozens of men from your town, and the destination is a place whispered about in both awe and dread, the pyramid worksite. The journey might take days, perhaps even weeks if you live far down the river. Boats carry groups of conscripted laborers north or south, their hulls heavy with passengers, supplies, and the low murmur of anxious voices. For some, this is the first time away from home, and the unknown weighs heavily. When at last the boat draws near the site, the first thing you notice is not the pyramid itself, but the scale of activity surrounding it. Even before the monument rises to its full height, the worksite is a city in its own right. Dust clouds billow where stonecutters hammer at blocks. Shouts echo from overseers commanding teams of men. Long lines of laborers haul sledges across the sand, ropes taut with the weight of stone. Smoke from cooking fires drifts skyward, mingling with the endless heat of the sun. The entire horizon seems alive with human effort, a hive buzzing with movement and sound. The camp where workers live is no makeshift encampment. Archaeological discoveries show that the Egyptians built permanent workers' villages near pyramid sites. Streets were laid out in neat lines, with long galleries of barrack-style housing, capable of sleeping dozens in close quarters. Nearby were bakeries, breweries, and storage facilities, each bustling with activity to keep the workforce fed and supplied. The presence of such infrastructure tells us that pyramid building was not random or chaotic, but meticulously planned, with the state pouring enormous resources into supporting its laborers. Upon arrival, you and your fellow recruits are assigned to crews. Each crew has a foreman who answers to higher overseers, and within days, you find yourself in a tightly organized system. Your group may be tasked with hauling stone, while another carves blocks, and yet another carries water from the Nile. Names are assigned to crews, often playful or prideful, such as the Strong Arms or the Friends of Khufu. These nicknames foster identity and camaraderie, binding men together in the face of endless labor. The tools of the trade are introduced to you quickly. You are handed ropes woven from papyrus or palm fibers, thick enough to bear enormous string. Wooden sledges creak under the weight of limestone blocks. Copper chisels, gleaming in the sun, are used to carve stone, though they dull quickly and must be hammered back into shape again and again. Simple wooden mallets, stone pounders, and levers round out the arsenal. There are no wheels, no iron machines, no miraculous devices, only the tools that human ingenuity and persistence can provide. The first task may be deceptively simple, moving a block of stone across level ground. With 20 men pulling ropes, you strain against the weight, feet digging into the sand. The sledge inches forward, wood groaning, sand scattering under the runners. A fellow worker pours water on the sand ahead of the sledge, reducing friction and making the block slide more easily. Progress is slow, but steady. By the time you reach your destination, your arms ache, your back throbs, and sweat has drenched your linen kilt. This, you realize, is only the beginning. At the edge of the site, the pyramid itself rises. In the early stages, it looks like a massive platform of stacked stone, far wider than it is tall. As construction progresses, ramps snake upward, stretching into the sky. These ramps are coated with dust and sand, slippery with use, and crawling with workers hauling loads. The sheer size overwhelms you. The pyramid is not just a building, it is a mountain being created by human hands. Standing at its base, you feel both awe and despair. How could anyone complete such a task? And yet, day after day, stones rise higher, proof that the impossible is made possible by sheer persistence. The sounds of the site become a constant backdrop to your life. The rhythmic thud of hammers on stone, the creak of sledges, the chants of work gangs moving in unison, and the shouts of overseers cutting through the air. Songs often accompany the hardest labor, chants that help synchronize movement and distract from exhaustion. Voices blend together in deep rhythms, a reminder that while the work is punishing, it is shared. Life in the workers' camp is another adjustment. Nights are spent in crowded quarters, men packed shoulder to shoulder on mats of woven reeds. The air is filled with the smell of sweat, smoke, and cooking. The bread provided is coarse but filling, the beer thick and nutritious, almost more food than drink. Onions and garlic add flavor. Fish from the Nile provides protein, and on good days, meat is distributed. Meals are eaten quickly, with little time for lingering. Rest is precious, for the dawn brings another long day of labor. What may surprise you most is the presence of medical care. Excavations of workers' villages reveal evidence of broken bones set carefully, of injuries tended with surprising skill. Egypt's physicians were advanced for their time, using herbs, bandages, and practical knowledge to keep laborers alive and able to work. This is not the care of slaves easily discarded, but of a workforce valued for its role in a national project. Even so, many succumb to injuries, heat stroke, or exhaustion, their lives cut short by the relentless demands of construction. Over time, the strangeness of the worksite becomes routine. You wake at dawn, line up with your crew, receive your assignment, and labor under the unrelenting sun. Breaks are brief, often just long enough to drink water or eat a ration of bread. The overseers pace constantly, eyes sharp for any sign of weakness. Fear of punishment keeps men moving, but so too does pride, for no one wants to be the one who falters, slowing the work of the group. And yet, despite the hardship, bonds form. In the evenings, men talk, laugh, and share stories. Graffiti carved into stones by workers shows that they had humor, naming their teams with playful or even mocking titles. They found moments of joy amid the toil, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, humanity endures. For the newly arrived worker, the first days are overwhelming. The sheer noise, the heat, the dust, and the scale of the task seem unbearable. Muscles ache in ways you did not know were possible. Hands blister until calluses form, and sleep comes heavy but never long enough. Yet as days turn into weeks, a rhythm develops. The pyramid grows higher, and with it, a sense of belonging. You are part of something vast, something eternal. Even if you never see the project completed, you know your labor is etched into stone, a contribution that will last long after your own body returns to the earth. This is the arrival at the worksite, a baptism by fire, an immersion into the greatest building project of the ancient world. For many, it is a test of endurance, spirit, and faith. For others, it is simply survival. But for all, it is a moment they will never forget, the day they first laid eyes on the mountain of stone that would define their lives. Once the dust of arrival settles, the daily rhythm of life in the workers' village begins to define every moment. The pyramid itself might dominate the skyline, but for those living and laboring in its shadow, the village is where most of life unfolds. It is a place of barracks and bakeries, of laughter and quarrels, of aching bodies and fleeting joys. Archaeologists today call this settlement Hayt el Gorab, the city of the pyramid builders, and what they have unearthed paints a vivid picture of how thousands of ordinary Egyptians lived while contributing to the most extraordinary monuments ever made. The village was laid out with surprising order. Streets ran in straight lines, intersecting with alleys, leading to long rows of galleries that served as dormitories. These barracks were simple but functional long halls with low walls dividing sleeping spaces. Mats woven from reeds lined the floor, and personal belongings were tucked away in niches. Privacy was almost non-existent, but the communal arrangement fostered solidarity. Each gallery could house dozens of men, all members of the same crew, who worked together by day and slept side by night. Friendships deepened in these cramped quarters, and bonds of loyalty formed, strengthened by the shared struggle of labor. At dawn, the village came alive. The sound of voices carried through the narrow streets as men stirred from sleep. Cooks lit fires in large ovens, preparing the bread and porridge that formed the foundation of every meal. The smell of baking bread drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of smoke and dust. Teams gathered to receive their rations for the day loaves of coarse barley bread, onions, garlic, dried fish, and most importantly, beer. Egyptian beer was thick and hearty, more like a liquid meal than the clear drink we know today. It was nutritious, hydrating, and essential fuel for long days under the sun. Work consumed most hours, but the village was not entirely a place of toil. In the evenings, when crews returned, there was time for talk, laughter, and sometimes even games. Simple board games like Senet were popular, played with pebbles and carved boards. Storytelling filled the night air, tales of gods, ancestors, and far-off adventures whispered by firelight. Some men sang, their voices rough but steady, echoing through the barracks as they recounted the chants they used during the day's work. Humor also flourished. Graffiti carved into stones or painted onto walls reveals that workers gave their crews names like the Drunkards of Menkaure, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, people found reasons to laugh. The village also provided something rare for laborers in the ancient world, medical care. Excavations have uncovered evidence of bones that were broken but carefully set, infections that were treated, and individuals who lived long after injuries that could have been fatal without intervention. This suggests that the workers were not disposable slaves, but valued laborers, provided with care so they could continue their duties. Physicians practiced in the settlement, skilled in herbal remedies, bandages, and treatments that were advanced for their time. To live in the workers' village meant being part of a system that, while demanding, also offered support. Life was not without conflict. Crowded quarters bred disputes, and tempers sometimes flared after long days of labor. Overseers enforced discipline with strict measures, and punishment for disobedience could be severe. Yet within the village, a sense of community often prevailed. Men looked out for one another, sharing food, tending to minor injuries, and supporting their comrades in moments of weakness. The bonds forged in those dormitories were bonds of survival. For families, the story was more complicated. Most workers were men, but evidence suggests that women and children also lived in or near the settlement. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and managed domestic tasks that kept the village running. Children may have fetched water, carried supplies, or simply played in the dusty streets while their fathers labored on the pyramid. Life in the village was not only about men enduring hard labor. It was also about entire communities uprooted and reshaped to serve a monumental project. The village was more than a home. It was a logistical hub. Storehouses brimmed with grain, dried fish, and jars of beer. Workshops hummed with activity as carpenters repaired sledges, rope makers twisted thick cords, and tool makers hammered copper chisels back into shape. Without this constant support, the work on the pyramid would have ground to a halt. Every loaf of bread baked, every jar of beer brewed, every tool sharpened was as vital as the muscle pulling stone. The pyramid was not only built on ramps, but on kitchens, workshops, and the unseen labor of those who never touched a block of stone. Night in the workers' village brought a kind of quiet, though never complete silence. The sounds of voices softened, fires crackled, and the desert air cooled. Men stretched their sore muscles, nursing blisters and wounds. Sleep came heavily, but it was never long enough, for dawn always came too soon. Yet in those brief hours of rest, there was also comfort in knowing that they were not alone, that thousands of others shared the same burden. Perhaps what strikes us most about the workers' village is how human it feels. These were not faceless drones, but people living real lives. They laughed, played, fought, healed, and dreamed. They endured hardships, but also found moments of joy. They carried the weight of stones by day and the weight of companionship by night. For many, the village was a place of both suffering and solidarity, where life was stripped down to its essentials: food, shelter, work, and the ties of community. To step into the workers' village was to step into a world where the ordinary and extraordinary met. On one side rose the pyramid, a project of divine ambition. On the other stood the village, a patchwork of humanity, sweat, and survival. The two were inseparable, for without the village, the pyramid could never have been built. In the shadows of stone, among the narrow streets and smoky kitchens, the real heart of pyramid building beat steadily. The pyramids might look timeless and smooth from afar, their colossal stones blending into a seamless whole. But up close, their creation was a matter of endless hammering, chiseling, hauling, and ingenuity. Unlike today, where machines can lift tons of stone with the press of a button, ancient Egyptian workers had nothing but their hands, their strength, and the simplest of tools. What seems impossible to us, moving blocks heavier than cars and stacking them hundreds of feet high, was achieved not with iron cranes or complex devices, but with wood, rope, stone, and copper. To step into the life of a pyramid builder was to step into a world where every ounce of progress came from tools that look almost primitive by modern standards, yet were wielded with extraordinary skill. The first and most basic tool was the hammerstone. Found in abundance along the Nile, these hard dolerite stones were used to pound and break limestone and even granite. A worker would lift one over and over, slamming it against the rock face until fragments cracked away. The sound was deafening, the work exhausting, and the progress painfully slow. Yet with time, precision, and countless hammer strikes, blocks began to take shape. For softer limestone, copper chisels were preferred. A chisel would be hammered against the stone with a wooden mallet, carving grooves until a block could be pried loose. Copper dulled quickly, however, and needed constant sharpening. Nearby workshops rang with the clang of metal being hammered back into form, while men sweated over forges to keep the tools sharp enough to bite again into the rock. Moving the blocks once cut was the next Herculean task. Here, the wooden sledge was king. Imagine a platform with runners, heavy but sturdy, designed to cradle a multi-ton stone. Dozens of men would grip thick ropes tied to its frame, leaning their bodies forward as they dragged the load inch by inch. To ease the journey, the sand ahead was often wetted with water, reducing friction and allowing the sledge to glide more smoothly. Experiments today confirm that this technique made a tremendous difference, cutting the force required nearly in half. Still, each haul demanded coordination, chanting voices keeping time, muscles straining in unison. Ropes themselves were critical. Twisted from papyrus fibers or palm leaves, they were surprisingly strong, able to withstand the constant tug of men and the grinding weight of stone. Rope making was an industry in its own right, with craftsmen producing endless coils to replace those that frayed and snapped under pressure. Without rope, nothing could move. Alongside ropes were wooden levers, simple poles used to pry stones into position, nudging them up ramps or settling them onto sledges. With enough men leaning into a lever, even a block weighing several tons could be coaxed into motion. Other tools might seem humble, but were no less vital. Wooden rollers, for example, were sometimes placed beneath sledges for short distances. Though on sandy ground, they proved less useful. Ramps, built of mud brick and rubble, were not tools in the strictest sense, but they were the great instruments of elevation. Layer upon layer of ramp material was packed tight, then coated with gypsum plaster to provide a smoother surface. As the pyramid rose, the ramps grew longer and higher, turning the desert into a maze of earthen highways designed for one purpose: to move stone upward. Marking and measuring tools were equally important. Scribes and architects used red ochre paint to mark cutting lines on stone, ensuring uniform shapes. Plumb bobs, made of stone weights tied to strings, checked vertical alignment. Levels filled with water ensured flat surfaces. Simple cords stretched across distances gave straight lines. To us these may seem primitive, but in skilled hands they produced astonishing precision. The alignment of the Great Pyramid to true north, accurate to a fraction of a degree, was achieved not with lasers or compasses, but with cords, stars, and the patient eye of a builder guided by the heavens. What makes these tools remarkable is not their sophistication, but their simplicity. They demanded endless labor to be effective. A hammerstone did not cut quickly. It shattered rock slowly, each strike sending chips flying. A copper chisel dulled within hours, forcing smiths to reforge it constantly. Ropes wore thin, sledges splintered, ramps crumbled under the weight of stone, and every day workers repaired and replaced them. The tools were extensions of the human body, amplifying strength but never replacing it. Every inch of progress required sweat, every cut measured in aching muscles. For the workers themselves, the tools shaped the rhythm of life. A stone cutter's hands became calloused and scarred from hammering. A rope puller's shoulders strained until knots of muscle formed from constant hauling. A carpenter spent his days fashioning sledges, his ears filled with the scrape of wood and the smell of shavings. Each trade had its tools, and each tool left its mark on the body. To look at a man in the village was to see the tool he wielded etched into his muscles, scars, and posture. But tools were not merely objects. They carried symbolic weight. In Egyptian art, the act of building and crafting was tied to creation itself, echoing the work of the gods who shaped the world. To strike stone with a hammer, to pull a rope, to set a block, these were not just physical actions, but sacred ones, contributing to the order and stability of the universe. Even the simplest hammerstone carried a kind of dignity, for in its dull pounding was the echo of eternity. Imagine yourself gripping a wooden lever, sweat stinging your eyes as you and your crew strain against the weight of a limestone block. Your feet slip in the sand, the rope burns against your palm, the sled groans forward a few inches. Around you, men chant in rhythm, their voices rising and falling with the heave. The overseer shouts encouragement or warning, his eyes fixed on the ramp ahead. It takes an hour to move the block a short distance, but when it reaches its place, cheers break out. The tools may be simple, but they achieve what seems impossible. The awe of the pyramids today often blinds us to the humble reality of their making. They are not miracles of lost technology, but monuments to persistence, to the marriage of human strength and simple tools wielded with discipline. Every hammerstone, every chisel, every rope was part of the story. Without them, the desert would hold no monuments, only silence. With them, men carved eternity out of stone. Before a single block could be hauled, lifted, or set into place on the pyramid, it had to be born from the earth. Quarrying was the first and perhaps most grueling stage of pyramid construction. To look upon the sheer size of a finished pyramid is to realize that the ground itself had to be stripped, carved, and shaped into tens of thousands of blocks. Each one represented hours of effort, hundreds of strikes, and countless adjustments. For the men tasked with cutting stone, the worksite was not the pyramid plateau, but the quarries, where the sound of hammering and chiseling echoed endlessly against bare rock. Most of the core blocks for pyramids were quarried from limestone, found near the construction sites themselves. At Giza, for instance, much of the stone was cut directly from the bedrock plateau, leaving behind pits and scars that can still be seen today. This made transport shorter and somewhat easier, but the labor of cutting each block remained immense. Workers would first mark the outline of a block using red ochre, drawing straight lines to guide their cuts. Then came the hammerstones. Heavy dolerite pounders swung again and again to break the stone along those lines. Over time, channels were carved around the block, isolating it from the bedrock until levers could pry it free. For higher quality limestone used in the outer casing, workers often had to travel farther afield. Tura, across the Nile, was famous for its bright white limestone, so smooth and fine that it gleamed in the sun. Blocks from Tura gave the pyramids their original dazzling appearance, shining like beacons under the desert sky. Quarrying here meant cutting deep shafts into the hillsides, hauling blocks upward and outward through narrow passages. It was dark, cramped, and perilous work, with torches flickering against stone as men chipped away in the gloom. The most daunting material, however, was granite. Used for the inner chambers and sarcophagi, granite came from Aswan, hundreds of miles upriver. Each block weighed dozens of tons, harder than any local stone. Workers armed only with dolerite pounders would chip out trenches around massive granite blocks, pounding day after day, sometimes for months, before a single block was freed. Even once released, the stone had to be dragged to the Nile, loaded onto barges, and floated north toward Giza. To imagine this process is to marvel at patience and determination beyond our comprehension. Quarrying was dangerous at every step. Chips of stone flew into the eyes, hammerstones slipped from hands, and blocks sometimes cracked in ways that ruined weeks of effort. Heat baked the quarry floor, and dust choked lungs. Workers bent over, striking for hours, their muscles screaming from repetition. The sound never ceased, the ringing of stone against stone, punctuated by the grunts of men and the shouts of overseers. At night, bodies collapsed in exhaustion, hands blistered and raw. The labor of quarrying was a battle of persistence. Each block wrestled from the earth like a prize. Organization in the quarries was as strict as on the pyramid plateau. Crews were divided into teams, each assigned to a section of rock. Overseers kept track of progress, scribes recorded block counts, and workers rotated tasks when fatigue became unbearable. Water had to be carried constantly to keep men hydrated and cool the pounding stones. Cooks followed the crews, preparing meals to keep energy high. Without this system, quarrying would have ground to a halt. There is evidence that songs and chants accompanied the work, steadying the rhythm of strikes. A team might chant in unison as they swung hammerstones, each voice rising and falling with the impact. The songs distracted from pain, created unity, and gave the labor a cadence, turning endless strikes into something almost ritual. For the Egyptians, rhythm was not only practical but spiritual, a way of aligning human effort with cosmic order. The sheer scale of quarrying is difficult to fathom. The Great Pyramid of Khufu alone required more than 2 million blocks of stone, weighing on average 2.5 tons each. Not every block was cut individually. Some were left in irregular shapes for the core, but even so, the volume of rock removed was staggering. To walk through the quarries today is to see vast, empty scars, silent now, but once alive with toil. Every pit, trench, and broken tool left behind tells the story of human endurance. Granite quarrying in Aswan holds its own awe. The famous unfinished obelisk, still lying in the quarry, reveals the method clearly. Workers carved trenches along its sides, pounding day and night, but a crack appeared, and the project was abandoned. The obelisk remains, half freed from the rock, a frozen testament to both ambition and failure. For every block successfully cut, there were others that broke, split, or were left behind, sacrifices to the difficulty of the task. Transporting the blocks after quarrying was itself another saga. But for the quarrymen, their task ended when the stone was pried loose, loaded onto a sledge, and hauled away. They returned to their hammerstones, their dust, their aching arms, to begin again. Each day blurred into the next, a cycle of noise and strain, with progress measured not in grand monuments, but in blocks counted and moved. The quarrying of stone reminds us that the pyramids did not emerge magically from the desert floor. They were carved, piece by piece, from the very bones of the earth, by men whose names we will never know. Each block carried within it the memory of hours of labor, of hammerstones chipped and broken, of sweat dripping into dust. The majesty of the pyramids stands on the shoulders of quarrymen, men who faced the raw stone and refused to yield until it did. To imagine standing in a quarry at midday is to feel the heat radiating from rock, to hear the echo of endless hammering, to taste the dust in the air. It is to know that the pyramid's grandeur was born not in silence, but in the roar of labor. And it is to understand why, for most of us today, the quarry alone would be enough to break our bodies and our will before we ever set foot on the pyramid's ramp. Cutting the stone was only half the battle. Once freed from the bedrock, each block, sometimes weighing 2 or 3 tons, sometimes far more, had to be transported from the quarry to the pyramid site. It is here, in the long journeys across sand and water, that some of the most astonishing feats of organization and endurance took place. Moving stone was not glamorous, but without it, the pyramid would have remained nothing more than a hollow dream carved into distant quarries. Imagine standing in the desert sun, facing a block taller than yourself, resting heavily on a wooden sledge. Ropes as thick as your arm are tied around its frame. Dozens of men stand ready, hands gripping the ropes, their muscles tense. At the overseer's shout, they lean forward in unison, feet digging into the sand as the sledge lurches into motion. The groan of wood fills the air, and the block slides forward slowly, grudgingly, as though reluctant to leave its place. Another man runs ahead with a jar of water, pouring it onto the sand. The wet ground darkens, compacting beneath the runners of the sledge, easing the journey just enough to make progress possible. Without this trick, the friction would have been unbearable, the block refusing to budge, no matter how many pulled. The sight of these block-hauling teams would have been unforgettable. Lines of men stretched across the desert floor, their backs bent under strain, voices chanting in rhythm to keep movement steady. The overseer's staff pointed forward, urging them on, while scribes marked their progress on papyrus rolls. A journey of a few hundred yards could take hours. If the block came from a local quarry, the distance might be manageable, but for stones hauled from Tura or Aswan, the trip was a saga in itself. When water transport was involved, the challenge multiplied. Blocks had to be hauled to the Nile, loaded onto massive wooden barges, and ferried downstream. Imagine maneuvering a block weighing dozens of tons onto a vessel without modern cranes. Workers built ramps leading into the water, sliding stones carefully onto the barges, balancing them so the boat would not capsize. Once afloat, fleets of barges drifted with the current, guided by long oars and sails when winds allowed. The river became a highway of stone, carrying the building blocks of eternity toward Giza. Villagers along the banks must have stopped to watch, marveling at the sight of floating mountains gliding past. Unloading was no less difficult. At the pyramid site, temporary harbors were constructed to receive the stones. From there, blocks were dragged up ramps leading from the riverbank to the plateau. Teams of men strained against ropes once more, chanting to maintain rhythm, sweat soaking their linen kilts. Every slope, every bump in the path, threatened disaster. If a block tipped from its sledge, the damage could be catastrophic, crushing men beneath it or splitting the stone itself. Death and injury were constant risks, lurking behind every haul. The longer the distance, the greater the danger. The transport of granite blocks from Aswan to Giza, a journey of over 500 miles, was a monumental achievement. These blocks weighed up to 80 tons each, and yet they were somehow cut, hauled, floated, and finally raised into position within the pyramid. The thought of such a feat almost defies belief. Each successful delivery was a triumph of planning, engineering, and sheer human will. Coordination was the heart of transportation. Crews were divided into shifts, some hauling, others resting, others preparing the path. Runners carried messages between teams, ensuring that water was ready at the right places, that ramps were maintained, and that ropes were repaired. Rope makers, carpenters, and water carriers worked behind the scenes, their labor just as essential as the men pulling the ropes. The entire system functioned like a living machine, each part supporting the other. The noise of transport was a constant in the pyramid landscape. The grind of wood on sand, the shouts of foremen, the grunts of straining men, and the crash of a block settling into place all combined into a harsh music of labor. The chants of workers often echoed across the desert, steadying their effort. Without rhythm, the pull would falter, ropes would lose tension, and progress would collapse. The songs carried them forward, transforming grueling labor into something bearable. Transporting stone was not only about physical strength, but also ingenuity. Workers learned to lubricate sledges with water and mud, to cut paths into the sand, to build causeways and ramps of rubble. They timed journeys to avoid the worst of the midday heat, moving blocks in the cooler hours when possible. They devised methods to prevent sledges from tipping, packing sand beneath runners or using levers to correct balance. Each haul was a puzzle, each solution hard-won by experience and trial. To imagine yourself in such a scene is to feel the rope burning into your palms, your muscles trembling as the block drags forward inch by inch. Your fellow workers chant beside you, their voices hoarse but steady. The overseer's voice cuts through the noise, urging you to keep moving, not to falter. Ahead, the pyramid looms, its unfinished tiers rising against the sky. The block you pull will soon join thousands of others, each one laid with the same backbreaking effort. It is in the transport of stone that we see most clearly why few of us today would endure such work. Our bodies are no longer conditioned for it, our lives too cushioned by ease. The thought of spending hours in the blazing sun, dragging a block of stone across sand, would send most of us fleeing in despair. Yet for the ancient Egyptians, this was life, this was duty, this was the path to both survival and glory. When the sun set and the day's work ended, the blocks stood where they had been dragged, ready to be lifted higher. The men staggered back to their barracks, muscles quivering, their bodies coated in dust. They ate their rations quickly, drank their beer, and collapsed into sleep. Tomorrow, another block would await, another journey across sand and ramp, another chance to pull eternity closer to the sky. If quarrying and transport were the foundation of pyramid construction, the ramps were the arteries that carried the lifeblood of stone upward. Without ramps, the pyramid would never have risen beyond its base. They were the invisible scaffolding, the paths of ascent along which thousands of blocks were dragged, lifted, and set into place. Today, the exact design of these ramps is still debated, with scholars offering competing theories, but what is certain is that they were massive in scale, requiring almost as much effort to build and maintain as the pyramid itself. For the workers, ramps were both a salvation and a torment, the means of progress, but also the steep hills they had to climb under crushing loads. The simplest ramp was the straight, linear kind, stretching from the ground up one face of the pyramid. This design is easy to imagine, a broad slope of mud brick and rubble, packed down firmly, long enough and gradual enough for men to haul sledges uphill. But a straight ramp leading to the top of a massive pyramid would have been several miles long, swallowing enormous amounts of material. Building such a ramp may have been possible for early pyramids, but for the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the scale seems nearly unthinkable. Other theories suggest zigzagging ramps, wrapping around the pyramid in switchbacks like a giant staircase carved into its surface. This design reduced the length of each ramp, but complicated the maneuvering of stones. Imagine dragging a multi-ton block up a slope, then turning sharply to angle it around a corner, all while keeping balance and momentum. The cries of workers, the groaning of sledges, and the risk of slipping must have been constant companions on those winding paths. Still another idea is the spiral ramp, encircling the pyramid as it rose. From below, such a ramp would have looked like a great snake coiling upward, carrying stones in a continuous climb. The challenge here was visibility. The pyramid's edges and angles would have been hidden from view, making precise placement of blocks more difficult. Yet for the workers, the spiral may have offered a more gradual ascent, spreading the labor more evenly across the monument's surface. Regardless of design, the ramps themselves were feats of engineering. They were built of mud brick, limestone chippings, and rubble, reinforced with retaining walls and constantly maintained. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps had to grow too, lengthened and raised to keep pace. This meant that even as men hauled blocks upward, other men labored to build the very roads beneath their feet. Entire crews were devoted not to the pyramid itself, but to the upkeep of its ramps. For every stone set into the monument, countless others were piled into temporary structures, destined to be dismantled once their purpose was served. To walk up one of these ramps was to feel the true weight of the pyramid. The slope stretched endlessly ahead, dust rising in clouds, the sun glaring off the pale limestone. At your back, dozens of men strained at ropes, chanting in rhythm, while you pushed alongside the sledge, shoulder braced, feet sliding in the sand. Every inch forward was a battle. The higher the ramp, the steeper the climb, the more dangerous the risk. If the sledge slipped, it could crash backward, crushing those behind. The chants became cries, the overseers' voices sharp with urgency, the air thick with fear as much as with dust. Yet there was also pride in the climb. Each block hauled up the ramp was a victory, another piece of eternity lifted into place. At rest stops along the way, men drank water, wiped sweat from their brows, and looked out across the desert. From high on the ramp, the view was vast. The Nile winding in the distance, villages scattered along its banks, the desert stretching endlessly beyond. For a moment, the laborer might feel a surge of wonder, realizing that he stood above the world, part of something greater than himself. At the top, the work was no easier. Stones had to be maneuvered into precise positions, nudged with levers, eased into place by teams shouting instructions. The ramp delivered the block, but human hands set it into eternity. The fit had to be exact, the alignment perfect, for the pyramid's geometry was sacred. Even a small error could ripple outward, distorting the entire structure. The workers' sweat mixed with dust, their voices echoing as they coaxed the block into its final home. Then, with a cheer, the sledge was dragged back down, the process beginning anew. The ramps themselves must have looked like colossal monuments in their own right. Imagine a slope of rubble wide enough for dozens of men to walk abreast, rising alongside the pyramid. Some scholars suggest they may have been as wide as 20 or 30 feet, stretching across the desert like man-made hills. Villagers approaching Giza would have seen not just a pyramid under construction, but an entire landscape reshaped into ramps, platforms, and causeways. The work site was not one monument, but many, all feeding into the creation of the pharaoh's eternal home. For the workers, ramps were both ally and enemy. They enabled progress, but they demanded endless toil. Every climb drained the body, every descent jarred the knees. Dust clung to skin and clothes, filling mouths and lungs. The ramps cracked under the weight of sledges, forcing repairs. Sometimes sections collapsed, sending stones tumbling and men scrambling for safety. Each accident was a grim reminder of the dangers hidden within the climb. Still, the ramps endured, and with them the pyramid rose. Stone by stone, tier by tier, the monument reached skyward. When finally the last blocks were set and the ramps dismantled, the pyramid stood bare and gleaming, its sides smooth and perfect, the temporary scaffolding erased as though it had never existed. Yet for those who built it, the memory of the ramps remained etched into their muscles, their bones, their very lives. To imagine yourself there is to feel the rope in your hands, the slope under your feet, the strain of a block fighting gravity as you push and pull it upward. It is to hear the chants of your crew, the bark of your overseer, the pounding of your heart in your chest. It is to know that the path to eternity was not flat but steep, carved into the desert in endless ramps of stone and sweat. To understand what it truly meant to build the pyramids, one must step into the shoes of a single worker and walk through his day. Not the grand sweep of decades, not the towering sight of millions of stones, but the rhythm of a single sunrise and sunset in the life of one man conscripted into service for the pharaoh's eternal house. In these ordinary details lies the heart of the pyramid story, the blisters, the hunger, the sweat, and the small moments of camaraderie that made survival possible. The day begins before dawn. The desert night, though cooler, offers little comfort in the crowded barracks of the workers' village. Men lie shoulder to shoulder on mats of woven reeds, their sleep cut short by snores, coughs, and restless movement. A whistle or a shout from the overseers pierces the pre-dawn silence, stirring everyone awake. The air smells of smoke from the early fires, mingling with the sour tang of sweat and dust. Workers groan as they rise, stretching sore muscles still aching from yesterday's labors. The first order of the day is food. Cooks are already busy in the large communal bakeries, pulling coarse loaves of barley bread from clay ovens. The bread is dense and filling, meant to fuel rather than delight. Alongside it comes beer, thick and cloudy, more like a porridge than a drink. It is packed with calories and nutrients, vital for men who will spend the day straining their bodies under immense loads. Onions, garlic, and dried fish are distributed as rations, their pungent smell filling the air. The meal is eaten quickly, with little conversation, each man focused on the long day ahead. Once fed, crews assemble. Foremen call out names, dividing workers into their groups. Each crew has its task hauling blocks up ramps, cutting stone in the quarries, repairing sledges, carrying water, or tending to animals. The organization is strict. Every man is accounted for, every duty noted. Scribes with reed pens and tablets record attendance, marking who is present, who is ill, and who has fallen behind. The system is efficient, designed to keep thousands moving in harmony toward the same goal. With the sun rising, the work begins. If you are assigned to hauling stone, you grip the thick rope tied to a sledge, carrying a block of limestone. Dozens of men strain alongside you, chanting in rhythm as the block groans forward. The sun climbs higher, its heat relentless, the sand reflecting it back into your face. Sweat pours into your eyes, your feet slip in the dust, your muscles burn. At intervals, overseers shout commands, urging more effort. A man runs ahead to pour water on the sand, the block sliding more easily for a short distance before resistance returns. Hours pass in this cycle of strain, rest, and strain again. If you are in the quarries, the work is no less brutal. You grip a dolerite hammerstone, lifting and slamming it against limestone again and again. Chips fly, dust coats your throat, and your arms feel heavy as lead. Around you, the sound is constant, 1,000 hammers ringing at once, like thunder trapped in stone. Breaks are brief, only long enough to sip water and wipe grit from your skin before the foreman signals you back to work. By midday, the sun is at its fiercest. Heat shimmers across the sand, and the air feels thick enough to choke. Breaks are longer now, if only to prevent collapse. Workers huddle in the shade of walls or ramps, tearing at bread, gulping beer, and stretching their sore bodies. Conversation grows louder here, men swapping jokes or complaints, some even singing to lighten the mood. For a brief moment, the heaviness of labor lifts, replaced by the comfort of shared humanity. But the respite does not last. The overseer's whistle calls you back, and the afternoon grind begins. This is often the hardest stretch, when fatigue weighs heavily and the sun seems unending. Blisters tear open, shoulders ache under the ropes, and tempers flare. Arguments break out, sometimes even fights, but the strict order of the overseers keeps them in check. Punishment is swift for disobedience, and no one dares risk the lash or worse. Still, the bond between men is strong, and when one falters, others often lift the slack, pulling harder to keep the block moving. By late afternoon, the pace begins to slow. The day's final hauls are made, the last stones set into place, the tools gathered and stored. Exhaustion hangs heavy in the air, but also a faint sense of accomplishment. Each block delivered, each stone cut, is a small victory in the endless march toward completion. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the half-finished pyramid, its rising tiers glowing red in the fading light. Workers glance upward, knowing that their labor has nudged it just a little closer to eternity. Evening in the workers' village is a time of noise and release. Fires are lit, and the smell of food fills the streets. More bread, more beer, sometimes meat if the rations are generous. Men eat hungrily, talking and laughing between bites. Children dart through the alleys, chasing one another in the dust. Women tend to cooking and weaving, their voices rising above the crackle of flames. After the meal, there is time for games, perhaps Senate, a board game of chance and fate, played with pebbles and carved boards. Some sing, their voices carrying into the night, while others sit in quiet groups, telling stories of the gods, of faraway lands, or of home. The night brings a kind of peace. The desert cools, Stars blaze overhead, and the chatter of the village softens to murmurs. In the barracks, men collapse onto mats, their bodies too weary for long conversations. Sleep comes quickly, heavy and deep, broken only by the occasional cough or restless turn. Tomorrow will be the same. The same bread, the same beer, the same chance, the same sweat. And yet, in this repetition, lies the heartbeat of the pyramid. Each day, identical in its labor, builds toward a monument that will outlast them all. To live a day in the life of a pyramid worker is to understand the rhythm of endurance, the early meal, the long hours of toil, the brief respite, the evening laughter, the exhausted sleep. It is not the grandeur of the pharaoh's vision that sustains you, but the company of those who labor beside you, the food that fills your belly, the songs that lighten your burden, and the stubborn will to rise again tomorrow. Behind every block hauled, every ramp repaired, and every tool sharpened stood not only the hands of laborers, but also the watchful eyes of overseers and the records kept by scribes. If the workers were the muscles of pyramid construction, the overseers and administrators were its nervous system, coordinating the flow of effort, so that thousands of men could function as a single machine. Without them, the project would have collapsed into chaos. To understand their role is to glimpse the immense organizational genius that lay at the heart of pyramid building. The overseers were everywhere, standing at the base of ramps, striding along the quarries, pacing the lines of rope pullers, their voices carried above the din of labor. They were men of authority, chosen not only for their loyalty to the pharaoh, but also for their ability to command and control. Some were veterans of other building projects, seasoned in the logistics of stone and sweat. Others were scribes, educated in the arts of numbers and words, who now applied their talents to directing human bodies instead of ink and papyrus. Whatever their background, their presence was constant, their authority unquestioned. Each overseer commanded a specific group, often called a phyle or gang, made up of around 200 men. These were further divided into smaller squads, each with its own foreman. The system ensured accountability at every level. If a block failed to arrive, if a crew fell behind, the responsible foreman could be identified and punished. Names of gangs were often playful, scrawled onto stones as graffiti, the Friends of Khufu, or the Drunkards of Menkaure, but beneath the humor was strict hierarchy. Every man knew his place, and every overseer knew exactly who owed him work. The scribes were the quiet power behind this order. With reed pens and pallets, they recorded the output of each crew, the arrival of supplies, the ration of bread and beer. On shards of pottery and flakes of limestone, they noted attendance, progress, and problems. Nothing escaped their tally. In some ways, the pyramid site was as much an office as a quarry, a place where numbers and names mattered as much as muscle. For the pharaoh, these records were proof that his project advanced toward completion. For the workers, they were reminders that every loaf of bread and every sip of beer was accounted for, tied to their labor. Discipline was enforced with both carrot and stick. Good crews received praise, extra rations, and recognition. Poor performance drew harsh rebuke. Punishments could range from beatings to the loss of rations, and in severe cases, expulsion from the project. Few could afford to risk such penalties. To lose the pharaoh's favor was to lose one's livelihood, or worse. Fear of overseers was real, but so too was the pride they inspired. To have your crew's name recorded as one of the best was an honor, a mark that you had contributed well to the eternal work. The organization extended beyond daily labor. Schedules were planned with precision. The flooding of the Nile dictated when farmers could be drafted, and overseers coordinated the arrival of these seasonal workers, so that the pyramid site never lacked manpower. Transport crews timed their journeys with the river's flow, ensuring that stone from quarries arrived in steady streams. Food deliveries were scheduled, bakeries and breweries worked in shifts, and medical teams rotated through the village. It was a choreography of logistics, each overseer like a conductor in a symphony of labor. To stand on the worksite was to hear their presence constantly. Overseers shouted encouragement, barked commands, scolded laggards, and urged crews to pull in rhythm. Their staffs tapped the ground as they paced, their eyes scanning for weakness or error. Workers might have cursed them under their breath, but without them, progress would have faltered. In a project where every delay threatened the pharaoh's eternal resting place, there was no room for disorder. The overseers themselves lived differently from the common laborers. Many had their own quarters, separate from the crowded barracks. They ate better food, drank finer beer, and enjoyed higher status. They were close enough to the pharaoh's officials to be respected, yet close enough to the workers to be feared. It was a precarious position. Success brought recognition, but failure could bring ruin. Their names might be remembered, carved into records, while the common worker remained anonymous, but their burden was heavy too. What makes this organization most remarkable is its scale. Imagine a workforce of 20,000 men or more, all needing to be fed, housed, supplied, and directed. Imagine stones arriving daily from quarries, sledges breaking down, ropes fraying, workers falling ill. Without a system, the project would drown in confusion. But with overseers and scribes, it became a living organism, each part functioning smoothly toward a single goal. This organizational structure also reflected Egypt's society at large. Just as the pyramid was built in layers, so too was Egyptian life. The pharaoh at the top, his officials below him, overseers beneath them, and finally, the mass of workers at the bottom. Each layer supported the one above. Each relied on the one below. The pyramid itself was a mirror of this hierarchy, a stone embodiment of the order that defined their world. For the worker, the overseer was both master and protector. He enforced discipline, yes, but he also ensured that rations were delivered, that tools were repaired, that the work moved forward. If you collapsed from exhaustion, it was the overseer who decided whether you received medical care or punishment. If your crew excelled, it was the overseer who took credit and sometimes shared it. To live under their gaze was to live in constant tension, torn between resentment and dependence. Yet without overseers, the pyramids would not exist. Their relentless drive kept the wheels of labor turning. Their sharp eyes caught mistakes before they grew fatal, and their records preserved the rhythm of progress. They were the architects of human energy, channeling thousands of men into a single, unstoppable force. To place yourself in this scene is to feel the weight of their presence. You pull the rope, sweat dripping, your muscles trembling, and above you stands the overseer, staff in hand, his voice cutting through the din. His gaze is unyielding, his expectations clear. You may hate him, but you follow him, because without him, the block would never move, and the pharaoh's dream would crumble into dust. To build in the desert was to labor under the most unforgiving overseer of all, the sun. Every day, without fail, it rose over the horizon of the Nile Valley, blazing across the sky with a heat that brooked no mercy. In the cool of dawn, there was a brief reprieve, a moment when the air still held the memory of night. But soon, the rays sharpened, the light grew harsher, and by mid-morning the pyramid site was a furnace. The workers might have been overseen by men with staffs and scribes with pens, but the true master of their endurance was the burning orb above them. The Egyptian sun was not gentle. It beat down relentlessly, reflecting off pale limestone and swirling clouds of sand. Temperatures soared past what the human body can comfortably bear, especially for men laboring with ropes, hammers, and sledges. Skin blistered, lips cracked, and sweat poured freely, soaking linen kilts until they clung like second skins. Shade was scarce. The pyramid itself cast long shadows, but the ramps and quarries offered little shelter. Workers often had to press on regardless, straining under blocks or hammering stone, even as the heat radiated through their bodies. Dehydration was a constant threat. Water carriers rushed through the site, hauling jars from the Nile or nearby wells, shouting for men to drink quickly before moving on. Without steady hydration, collapse was inevitable. Some men fainted, their bodies overcome by the combination of exertion and heat. Those who recovered were fortunate. Others were carried away, unable to return. Even with water, the exhaustion was overwhelming. To drag a block uphill in the full blaze of noon was to feel the sun not just on your skin, but in your very bones. The dust made everything worse. Each hammer strike sent clouds of fine powder into the air, filling mouths and lungs. Sweat turned dust to mud on workers' skin, coating them in a gritty paste. Eyes burned, throats ached, and coughing became as familiar a sound as chanting. The sun transformed dust into a shimmering haze, blurring vision, making the edges of ramps and stones harder to see. Mistakes were easy to make in such conditions, and accidents all too common. Clothing offered little protection. Workers wore simple linen kilts, light enough to breathe, but too thin to shield against the sun's glare. Their heads were often bare, the heat striking directly. Some tied cloths around their brows, dampening them with water when possible, but the relief was brief. Sandals, if worn at all, quickly filled with grit, rubbing raw blisters onto feet already sore from endless climbing. In many ways, the body was exposed, vulnerable, and at the mercy of the elements. The rhythm of the day reflected the tyranny of the sun. Work began as early as possible, when the air was still cool. Midday brought longer pauses, when men huddled in what scraps of shade they could find, gulping water and tearing into rations of bread and onions. Yet even these breaks could not be extended too long. The pharaohs' project waited for no one. As soon as overseers gave the signal, men returned to their posts, squinting into the blazing sky, bracing themselves for the worst hours of the afternoon. The labor continued until the light softened again, and only then did exhaustion drive them back to the village. The toll on the body was relentless. Skin darkened, toughened, and burned. Lips bled from dryness. Hands split from gripping hot ropes and levers. Muscles trembled with fatigue, and sleep, when it came, was heavy but rarely restorative. The next day, the sun would return, and the cycle would begin again. Unlike the overseers, who might be rotated or replaced, the sun was always present, a constant reminder of nature's power over man. But there was also a strange rhythm to it, one that the workers came to accept. The sun, like the pyramid, was eternal in its way. Its rising and setting marked their lives, its light the backdrop of every task. Songs and chants often referenced it, calling for strength, endurance, or relief. To labor under the sun was to share in the rhythm of creation itself, for in Egyptian belief, the sun god Ra sailed across the sky each day, bringing light and order to the world. Workers may have cursed the heat, but they also understood its sacred place in their universe. Still, for most of us today, such exposure would be unbearable. We who are used to shade, to water bottles within reach, to fans and air conditioning, would wilt within hours. To imagine hauling stone up a ramp while the desert sun scorched every breath is to realize how fragile our comfort has made us. For the pyramid builders, the sun was not just background, it was the constant trial, the daily test of body and spirit. At night, when the heat finally faded, the workers could look up at the sky and see the stars spread across the desert. The cool air felt like a blessing, a relief from the day's torment. Yet even in rest, they knew the sun would return. It always returned, eternal as the stone they raised, unrelenting, unchanging, forever watching as the pharaoh's house climbed higher into its light. The weight of the sun was not measured in pounds or stones, but in endurance. It pressed down on every man, every day, searing itself into their memory as much as into their skin. It was the invisible stone each worker carried, heavier than any block, impossible to set down. And still, They bore it, because to stop was to fail, and failure was unthinkable in the shadow of the pharaoh's command. The human body is a machine, and without fuel, even the strongest arms and backs cannot drag a stone across sand or up a ramp. For the workers who built the pyramids, food and drink were not luxuries, they were survival. The state knew this well. To keep tens of thousands of men laboring under the desert sun, a constant stream of rations had to flow into the workers' village every single day. The pyramid itself may have been built of limestone and granite, but it was also built of bread, beer, onions, and fish, the staples that kept men on their feet when exhaustion threatened to drag them down. The foundation of the workers' diet was bread, not the soft, airy loaves we might imagine, but dense, coarse barley bread packed with calories. The grain was ground on stone querns, often by women in the settlement, who spent hours kneeling over grinding stones, their hands moving rhythmically back and forth. The flour produced was mixed with water and yeast, baked in clay ovens into round, heavy loaves. These loaves were filling, though gritty with sand from the grinding stones. Workers' teeth often wore down prematurely, the enamel eroded by this ever-present grit. Yet the bread was indispensable, the core of every meal, the foundation of energy for the day's labor. Beer was just as vital, though it was not the crisp, golden drink of modern times. Egyptian beer was thick, almost porridge-like, brewed from barley loaves that were partially baked, crumbled into water, and left to ferment. The result was a cloudy, nutritious drink, rich in calories and safer to consume than plain water. Workers were issued rations of beer daily, sometimes several liters worth, enough to quench thirst and provide sustenance during the long hours of toil. Beer was not a luxury. It was the fuel of labor, consumed morning, noon, and night. Onions and garlic were another essential part of the diet. Their pungent flavor cut through the monotony of bread and beer, but they also provided vitamins and helped ward off illness. Ancient writers even claimed that pyramid workers valued onions so highly that strikes broke out when rations fell short. Whether or not this is literally true, the abundance of onion skins found at worker sites testifies to their importance. Garlic, too, was prized, eaten raw or crushed into stews. For men sweating in the sun, these foods replenished salt and minerals lost to endless labor. Fish from the Nile added protein, often salted and dried, so it could be transported and stored without spoiling. Bones of fish have been found in abundance at the Giza workers' village, showing that this was a regular staple. Meat, while rarer, was not absent. Cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered to feed the workforce, especially the skilled laborers and overseers. The bones of cattle unearthed at Giza suggest that thousands of animals were consumed over the course of construction, an astonishing commitment of resources to feed the laborers. For ordinary Egyptians, meat was an occasional treat. For pyramid workers, it was a reward, proof that their work was valued. Other foods added variety: lentils, chickpeas, figs, and dates. Honey sweetened certain dishes, though it was a rarity, more likely reserved for overseers than common laborers. Salt preserved fish and meat, while herbs added small touches of flavor. Meals were simple, but together they formed a diet strong enough to sustain back-breaking work. The sheer volume was staggering. To feed a workforce of 20,000 required thousands of loaves baked each day, countless jars of beer brewed and distributed, and wagon loads of onions, fish, and grain delivered without fail. The logistics of feeding so many were as impressive as the construction itself. Bakers worked constantly, producing bread in massive ovens that turned out thousands of loaves daily. Brewers stirred vats of fermenting grain, their hands sticky with the sweet-sour mash. Herds of cattle were driven in from the countryside, their fate sealed in the kitchens of the workers' village. Scribes recorded every delivery, every ration, assuring that no man went without. For the pharaoh's project to succeed, food had to flow like stone, steady and unbroken. Meal times brought brief relief from labor. At midday, crews gathered in the shade, tearing into bread, gulping beer, and crunching raw onions. The chatter of men filled the air, laughter breaking out as they swapped stories or complaints. For a short while, the burden of the sun lifted, replaced by the comfort of food and camaraderie. In the evenings, after the day's work, meals were larger, sometimes with meat, always with more beer. Fires lit up the village, the smell of roasting flesh drifting through the alleys, voices rising in song or argument. These meals were not feasts by modern standards, but they were moments of life, a reminder that even amid toil, there was time for joy. Food also carried meaning beyond sustenance. In Egyptian belief, nourishment was tied to life itself, a gift from the gods. To eat bread and drink beer was to share in the divine order, to participate in the cycle of creation. Offerings of bread and beer were made to the gods in temples, and in a sense, the rations given to workers echoed that sacred act. They were not only eating for themselves, but for the pharaoh, for the gods, for the eternity of Egypt. For us today, the idea of surviving on coarse bread, thick beer, and pungent onions might seem unappealing. Yet for the workers, it was fuel, and more than that, it was security. Many peasants in villages could not count on steady meals, but at the pyramid site, rations were regular, dependable, and by the standards of the time, generous. To be fed by the state was no small comfort, even if the work demanded nearly everything in return. When you imagine sitting among the workers, tearing off chunks of bread, washing them down with beer, biting into an onion so sharp it stings your eyes, you glimpse their reality. The food was simple, but it kept them alive. Without it, no stone would have moved, no ramp would have risen, no pyramid would have touched the sky. The great monuments of Egypt were built as much on bread and beer as on limestone and granite. The building of the pyramids was not simply a test of endurance, but a gamble with the body itself. Every day on the worksite brought the risk of accidents, strains, and sickness. The sheer scale of labor hauling stones that could crush men flat, swinging hammerstones until arms trembled, enduring dust that choked lungs, meant that injury was inevitable. What sets the pyramid builders apart from many other ancient laborers, however, is that they were not left to suffer unaided. Evidence shows that workers were cared for by physicians, treated with surprising skill, and given the chance to heal so they could continue their service to the pharaoh. Life in the workers' village was brutal, yes, but it was also supported by one of the most advanced medical systems of the ancient world. Imagine hauling a block up a ramp when suddenly the sledge jerks, the rope slips, and you tumble backward, your leg twisted under the weight. In many societies of the ancient world, such an injury would mean the end of usefulness. But at Giza, bones discovered from the period reveal careful setting of fractures. Legs were splinted, arms bound with linen bandages, and men were given the chance to mend. Some even healed well enough to return to work, their bones showing evidence of proper alignment. This was no accident, but the result of medical care delivered by trained practitioners who lived among the workers. Egyptian medicine combined practical treatment with spiritual belief. Doctors, called swanwi, knew how to clean wounds, apply poultices made from herbs and honey, and bind injuries with linen. Honey, with its antibacterial properties, was a common salve, applied to cuts and abrasions to prevent infection. Herbs such as garlic, onion, and willow bark provided relief from pain and swelling. Oil and fat were rubbed into sore muscles, easing the strain of endless labor. At the same time, prayers and incantations were spoken over the injured, for illness and injury were seen not only as physical problems, but also as spiritual imbalances. One of the greatest threats to the workers was exhaustion itself. Under the blazing sun, dehydration and heat stroke struck often. Men collapsed, their skin hot, their eyes glazed. Water carriers rushed to cool them, while physicians attempted to revive them with cool cloths, rest, and fluids. some recovered. Others did not. The desert took its toll without pity. Respiratory illnesses were another constant danger. Dust from limestone filled the air, coating throats and lungs. Chronic coughs plagued workers, and some developed more serious conditions from years of exposure. The physicians could offer herbs and honey to soothe the throat, but relief was often temporary. Injuries from tools were frequent. Hammerstones slipped, copper chisels cut deep into hands, and wooden sledges splintered, driving sharp fragments into flesh. Rope burned scarred shoulders and palms, leaving open wounds vulnerable to infection. Cuts were cleaned with wine or vinegar, then bandaged with strips of linen. Broken skin was an invitation to disease, and infection could spread quickly in the heat and dust. That many workers survived such injuries is testament to the care they received. Archaeological finds show skeletons of men who lived years after serious injuries that would have been fatal without treatment. The care extended even to those who could not return to work. Graves found near the workers' village contain individuals buried with respect, suggesting that even when death came, the community did not abandon its own. Some skeletons show evidence of lifelong conditions, diseases of the spine, malformed limbs that would have made hard labor impossible. Yet these people survived for decades, which implies that the community supported and fed them. This was not the treatment of slaves to be discarded, but of laborers valued enough to be cared for, even in weakness. Overseers played a role in ensuring that medical care was given, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. Every worker represented investment, food, housing, and training. To lose men to preventable injuries meant losing progress on the pyramid. The pharaoh's vision demanded efficiency, and efficiency demanded keeping the workforce alive and functional. Thus, physicians were as critical to pyramid building as stonecutters and rope pullers. Yet medical care had limits. The dangers of the site could not always be avoided. Stones sometimes slipped from ramps, crushing men beneath their weight. Collapses of earth or ramp material buried workers alive. Accidents with ropes or sledges left bodies broken beyond repair. These men were carried away, their absence noted by scribes, their lives ended in service to eternity. No amount of honey or herbs could save them from the risks inherent in dragging mountains into the sky. To place yourself in that world is to imagine a moment of agony, a hand split open by a chisel, a leg fractured by a fall. You are carried to a shaded corner where a physician cleans your wound with honey, binds it with linen, and murmurs prayers to ward off infection. You lie in the workers' village for days, your companions bringing you food and water. Slowly, the pain eases, the wound scabs, and you regain strength. Perhaps you return to the ramp, your body scarred but still useful. Perhaps your injury leaves you weak, and you remain in the village, helping with lighter tasks. In either case, you survive, and in the ancient world, survival itself was a victory. The story of medical care among pyramid workers reminds us that these were not faceless laborers thrown away when broken. They were men whose health mattered to the success of the project, men who were supported by a system that combined compassion, practicality, and necessity. Their scars became part of the pyramid itself, invisible but enduring, written into the bones of those who carried stone after stone. For us today, accustomed to doctors, hospitals, and medicine at every turn, it is difficult to grasp how remarkable such care was 4,000 years ago. Yet the evidence is there, etched in bones and bandages, in the survival of men who would otherwise have perished. The pyramids were not only monuments of stone, but also of medicine, built on bodies that endured because they were tended, healed, and sustained. If the sun, the overseers, and the tools defined the harshness of pyramid labor, it was the human bonds among the workers that made such labor bearable. No man could have endured the endless hauling, the searing heat, or the constant strain alone. The strength of the pyramid was not only in its stone blocks, but also in the solidarity of the men who pulled, hammered, and sweated together. In the narrow galleries of the workers' village, on the ramps beneath the burning sky, and in the dim quarries echoing with hammer strikes, friendships were forged that carried men through exhaustion and despair. Life in the barracks pressed men close together, both physically and emotionally. Sleeping mats lay side by side, bodies packed into long halls with little privacy. You heard your neighbor's breathing, his snores, his muttered dreams. You shared food, passed cups of beer, and traded jokes whispered in the dark. Arguments broke out, as they do wherever men are crowded together, but those quarrels were often short-lived. The reality of the next day's labor demanded unity. A rope would not move a stone unless every hand pulled in rhythm. The bond among workers was not a luxury, but a necessity, forged by the need for survival. On the ramps, these bonds showed most clearly. A crew pulling a block worked as one, their voices chanting to keep pace, their bodies straining together. If one man faltered, the block slowed, and the group risked losing momentum. To see a comrade stumble was to feel the rope grow heavier in your own hands. Quickly, others would step in, shouting encouragement, hauling harder until the stone moved again. Each success was shared, each failure felt by all. The chant itself was more than rhythm. It was a voice of unity, reminding each man that he was part of something larger, carried forward not only by muscle, but by the spirit of the group. Even in hardship, humor thrived. Graffiti carved into stones shows that workers gave their crews playful names. The Friends of Khufu, the Vigorous Gang, even the Drunkards of Menkaure. These names were not official titles, but expressions of identity, a way for men to laugh at themselves and their toil. Jokes and nicknames softened the harshness of the work, turning endless days into shared stories. When a crew finished hauling a block, they might scrawl their name onto it, a small rebellion against anonymity, a mark that said, "We were here, we did this together." Evenings in the workers' village reinforced these bonds. After long hours of labor, men gathered around fires, their voices carrying through the dusty streets. They ate side by side, tore bread from the same loaves, and passed jars of beer hand to hand. Some played Senet, a board game of fate and chance, while others told stories of their villages, their families, or the gods. Laughter echoed, arguments flared, songs rose into the night. In those moments, men were not just laborers, but companions, brothers in hardship, bound by the weight of the same ropes and the same sun. Shared suffering created shared loyalty. When one man fell sick, others carried his rations to him. When injuries struck, crewmates helped bind wounds or fetch water. The presence of medical care softened the burden, but it was the compassion of fellow workers that truly sustained the injured. To be part of a crew meant that you were never entirely alone, even when pain or exhaustion struck hardest. The pyramid demanded sacrifice, but it also forged solidarity, a kind of fellowship that could not be broken by the lash of overseers or the glare of the sun. These bonds extended beyond life. Burial sites near the workers' village show that men who died during the project were laid to rest with care, sometimes alongside their comrades. Their graves were simple but deliberate, proof that even in death they remained part of the community. To labor on the pyramid was to become part of a brotherhood, one that extended into eternity itself. For us today, it is easy to see only the hardship, the sweat, the blisters, the broken bones. But within that hardship was humanity, and within humanity was companionship. The workers did not labor as isolated bodies, but as living parts of a whole, connected by chance, by meals, by shared memories of endless days. Those bonds gave them strength beyond their muscles, strength enough to move mountains of stone. Picture yourself standing in the village at dusk. The pyramid looms in the distance, glowing red in the fading sun. Around you, men laugh, sing, and share food. The exhaustion of the day is still etched into their bodies, but in this moment, the weight of stone seems lighter. You realize that without these bonds, no one would have lasted a week on the ramps. With them, even the impossible became possible. The bond among workers was the unseen mortar of the pyramids, binding men together as tightly as limestone blocks. It is why the pyramids still stand, not only because of stone and sweat, but because of camaraderie, loyalty, and the unbreakable ties of human fellowship. For all the order imposed by overseers and the bonds of camaraderie among workers, pyramid construction remained one of the most dangerous undertakings of the ancient world. The sheer size of the stones, the height of the ramps, the unpredictability of the desert environment, and the constant strain on human bodies meant that accidents were not a possibility, they were a certainty. To walk onto the worksite each day was to gamble with your health, and sometimes with your life. The most obvious danger came from the stones themselves. Blocks weighing several tons were hauled by ropes and sledges, often up steep ramps. If a rope snapped, if men lost their footing, if the balance shifted even slightly, the block could tumble with devastating force. Men caught beneath had no chance. Even those nearby risked broken bones or crushed limbs. The overseer's constant vigilance could not erase the fact that every block was a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. The ramps were treacherous in their own right. Built of rubble and mud brick, they had to bear enormous weight day after day. The surface, packed with dust and sand, grew slick under constant use. Men pushing sledges could easily slip, tumbling backward into their crewmates. Entire sections of ramp sometimes collapsed, burying workers under cascades of rubble. Repairs were constant, but danger lurked in every climb. To look up the slope was to see not only the path to eternity, but also the possibility of sudden death. The quarries were no safer. Workers swinging hammerstones faced flying chips of rock that could blind an eye or cut deep into flesh. Dust filled lungs, leaving men coughing and gasping for air. Blocks pried loose from bedrock sometimes shifted unexpectedly, crushing feet or pinning bodies. The sound of pounding was a constant roar, masking cries for help. In such a place, injury was never far away. Heat compounded every risk. Exhaustion slowed reflexes, making slips and mistakes more likely. Men staggered under the weight of stones, their muscles trembling, their vision blurred by sweat. Dehydration led to fainting, and a man who collapsed mid-haul endangered not only himself, but the entire crew. A desert sun turned every task into a hazard, stripping men of strength until even the simplest action carried risk. Tools could betray as well. Copper chisels dulled and sometimes shattered, sending sharp fragments flying. Wooden sledges splintered under strain, driving jagged shards into workers' skin. Ropes frayed, snapping without warning. Each tool, as essential as it was, carried within it the seeds of danger, a reminder that human ingenuity came at a price. Illness was another silent threat. The crowded conditions of the workers' village made disease easy to spread. Coughs turned into fevers, stomach ailments passed quickly through the barracks. Cuts and blisters, if not properly treated, became infected, swelling with pus, sometimes leading to death. Even with skilled physicians on site, the limits of ancient medicine could not prevent all losses. And then there were the punishments. Overseers enforced order with harsh measures. A man who disobeyed, who shirked his duties, who failed to keep pace, might be beaten. The lash of authority fell not only on those who resisted, but also on those who simply faltered under exhaustion. Fear of punishment drove men to push themselves beyond safe limits, sometimes to the point of collapse. Discipline ensured progress, but it also added another layer of danger to lives already burdened with risk. Despite these hazards, the work continued day after day. Accidents were recorded, men were buried, and crews moved forward regardless. For the pharaoh's vision to be realized, human lives were expendable. The pyramid demanded sacrifice, and the workers knew it. Yet they returned each dawn, not because they sought danger, but because they had no choice, and because to serve in the pharaoh's project was, in its way, an honor. For us today, it is difficult to imagine such constant peril. We live in a world of safety measures, protective gear, and regulations. To step onto the pyramid site would be to step into a place without guardrails, without harnesses, without warning signs. The dangers were everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the work. Few of us would last a day before injury or fear drove us away. And yet the workers endured. They accepted the risks as part of life, as inevitable as the sun's rise or the Nile's flood. They faced them with courage, with resignation, and with the strength of those who had no other choice. The dangers of the worksite were real and relentless, but so too was the determination of the men who built eternity out of stone. To stand there, at the base of the pyramid, is to hear the creak of ropes, the chant of men, the shout of overseers, and to feel the weight of danger in every sound. It is to know that beneath the grandeur of the finished monument lies a history written in risk, injury, and sacrifice. The pyramids may stand as symbols of eternity, but they were raised on lives that were fragile, mortal, and all too often cut short. Amid the dust, the sweat, and the danger, there was something that bound the workers to their task beyond rations and discipline. The pyramids were not only construction projects, they were sacred undertakings, steeped in religion and belief. To the ancient Egyptians, the work was not just labor for a king, but devotion to the gods and to cosmic order itself. Without this sense of purpose, the unbearable might have broken men. With it, their toil was transformed into something larger, something eternal. The pharaoh himself was at the heart of this motivation. He was not seen as a mortal ruler alone, but as a divine being, the living embodiment of Horus, destined in death to join Osiris, lord of the afterlife. To build his tomb was to ensure his journey into eternity, and through him, the prosperity of Egypt itself. If the pharaoh's afterlife was secured, so too was the continued favor of the gods upon the land, the flooding of the Nile, the fertility of the fields, the order of the cosmos. The pyramid was not just his eternal house. It was the axis upon which Egypt's stability turned. For workers, this belief made the hardship meaningful. Every stone hauled was not merely for the pharaoh's glory, but for the preservation of Ma'at, the principle of balance and order that governed the universe. Without Ma'at, chaos threatened famine, drought, war. To place a block into the pyramid was, in essence, to place a stone in the foundation of the world itself. Rituals reinforced this sense of sacred duty. Offerings were made at the worksite to deities connected with labor and protection. Small shrines may have stood near the workers' village, where prayers were spoken before shifts. When accidents occurred, priests were summoned to perform rites for the dead, ensuring their souls were not lost. The presence of religion softened the brutality of life, framing it not as meaningless suffering, but as a necessary contribution to divine order. Songs sung during labor often carried religious overtones. Chants invoking the strength of gods like Ptah, patron of craftsmen, or Khnum, the ram-headed creator who shaped mankind from clay, echoed along the ramps. These chants were not only for rhythm, they were prayers in motion, voices lifted to call down endurance from higher powers. To chant together was to believe together, to share in the sacred task of raising the pharaoh's house toward the heavens. Motivation also came from hope for personal reward. While the pharaoh's eternal afterlife was paramount, Egyptians believed that service to the divine king could earn favor in their own passage to the afterlife. To work on the pyramid was to secure not only food and rations in this life, but blessings in the next. Tomb inscriptions from later periods suggest that labor for the king was viewed as meritorious, a deed that might be remembered by the gods when one's own soul stood before judgment. There was also pride in permanence. Most laborers were peasants whose daily lives revolved around crops that grew and died with the seasons. But to contribute to a pyramid was to touch eternity. Long after their own bodies returned to dust, the stones they set would remain. To look up at the rising monument was to see proof that their sweat and pain were not in vain. The pyramid was the ultimate legacy, and though their names were forgotten, their work was carved into stone that would outlast centuries. Community belief magnified personal motivation. To refuse service, to shirk labor, was not only to disobey overseers, but to betray Egypt itself. The project was a national endeavor, drawing men from villages across the Nile Valley. Each worker knew that his effort was part of something larger than himself, something shared by thousands. Pride, religion, fear, and hope all mingled together, forging motivation as strong as rope. Still, faith did not erase exhaustion. There were surely moments of doubt, when men cursed the pharaoh under their breath, when pain felt greater than devotion. Yet even then, the structure itself stood as a reminder. To see the pyramid rising stone by stone was to see belief made visible. Each day it grew taller, more impressive, more sacred. Its sheer presence reinforced the idea that the work was worthwhile, that the pharaoh truly was divine, that the gods watched over the labor. Religion also gave comfort in loss. When a comrade was killed in an accident, rites were performed to guide his soul to the afterlife. Death was not seen as the end, but as a transition. The man who fell beneath a block or collapsed from heat stroke had not died in vain. He had given his life to the service of the king and the gods. This belief did not erase grief, but it gave it meaning, softening sorrow with the assurance of eternal reward. For us today, accustomed to secular work and personal ambition, it is hard to grasp how powerful this motivation was. We might drag a stone for a wage, but would we do it for eternity? For the pyramid builders, the answer was yes. Their labor was not just toil but faith, their sweat an offering, their endurance a form of worship. To stand among them is to feel that mixture of exhaustion and devotion. The rope burns your hands, your body trembles, but in your heart you believe that Are sails above you, that Osiris waits below, that the pharaoh you serve is the bridge between heaven and earth. The stone you drag is more than limestone. It is a prayer, a gift to the gods, a piece of order set against the chaos of the world. In this way, religion did not merely motivate the builders. It sanctified their suffering, transformed hardship into holiness, and bound their lives to the eternal vision of Egypt's divine kings. The pyramids are not just monuments of stone, but monuments of faith, each block a testament to the power of belief to move mountains. After decades of toil, of ramps built and dismantled, of stones hauled from quarries and floated down the Nile, there came a day when the pyramid was finally finished. For the workers who had lived and labored beneath its shadow, this moment was both awe-inspiring and bittersweet. The monument that had consumed their lives now stood complete, rising into the sky as though it touched the realm of the gods. Where once there had been a bare plateau and a bustle of quarries, there now stood a gleaming mountain of stone, its sides smooth and perfect, reflecting the sun so brightly that it could be seen for miles. The final stages of construction were among the most precise. The outer casing stones, cut from the fine limestone of Tura, were polished and set with painstaking care. These gleaming white blocks gave the pyramid its radiant finish, transforming the rough tiers of stone into a flawless surface. Workers nudged them into place with levers, aligning them so perfectly that the seams between stones were nearly invisible. The capstone, or pyramidion, often covered in gold or electrum, was lifted last, crowning the structure with a shining beacon that caught the sun's rays at dawn and dusk. To witness its placement must have felt like watching the pharaoh's eternal star ascend into the heavens. For the workers, pride mingled with relief. Many had grown old in the service of the project. Their youth spent beneath its ramps, their strength poured into its stones. Some had died along the way, buried near the village they had called home. Others had left and returned, drafted season after season during the Nile floods. To stand at the base of the completed pyramid was to see their labor made eternal, proof that their suffering had not been in vain. In their hearts, they knew they had built something that would outlast their lives, their children, and even their children's children. The completion also marked the pharaoh's preparation for death. Once finished, the pyramid became a tomb, its hidden chambers filled with treasures, food, and objects meant to accompany him into the afterlife. Priests performed elaborate ceremonies, sealing the inner passages, ensuring that the king's spirit could ascend to the heavens. For the workers, these rituals were reminders of the divine purpose of their labor. The pyramid was no longer a worksite. It was now a sacred monument, the eternal house of a god-king. The village, once bustling with labor, began to change. Some workers returned to their farms, resuming the cycle of planting and harvest. Others stayed on, repairing temples, building smaller tombs for nobles, or maintaining the causeways and mortuary temples connected to the pyramid. Life shifted, but the memory of the years spent in service lingered. The camaraderie of the barracks, the chants on the ramps, the evenings of bread and beer, these became stories told to grandchildren, echoes of a time when they had been part of something greater than themselves. For Egypt as a whole, the completion of a pyramid was a moment of national pride. It proclaimed the power of the pharaoh, the unity of the people, and the favor of the gods. Travelers from distant lands saw the shining monument and marveled, carrying tales of Egypt's greatness back across deserts and seas. The pyramid stood not only as a tomb, but as a symbol, a declaration that Egypt was eternal, unshakable, and blessed by the divine. The legacy of these monuments cannot be overstated. Even today, millennia later, the pyramids of Giza remain among the most enduring symbols of human achievement. Tourists from around the world stand in awe where ancient workers once labored, their voices hushed by the sheer scale of the stone before them. The names of the laborers are forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but their work still speaks, louder than any words. Each block is a voice, whispering of sweat and strength, of chants in the sun, of bonds forged in hardship. Yet for all the glory, we must also remember the cost. The pyramids were not miracles. They were monuments built on human lives. Men gave their strength, their youth, and sometimes their lives to raise them. Families were separated, villages disrupted, and countless bodies were worn down by the unrelenting demands of stone. The grandeur of the finished pyramid hides the suffering that made it possible. But in that suffering, too, lies legacy, for it shows the endurance of the human spirit, the ability to create permanence from fleeting lives. To stand at the completion of a pyramid is to feel both triumph and humility. Triumph, because the impossible has been achieved, a mountain raised by human hands. Humility, because it reminds us how small one life is in the sweep of history, and yet how powerful when joined with thousands of others. The pyramid is eternal, but so too are the invisible hands that built it, their effort carved into every block. The workers may never have imagined that thousands of years later, people would still gaze upon their work in wonder. Yet in some way, perhaps they did. Perhaps, as they watched the final capstone set in place, they felt a spark of certainty that what they had made would endure forever. And in that moment, standing in the glow of the completed pyramid, they saw their own legacy reflected in stone anonymous, but eternal, hidden, but unbreakable. To look back on the daily lives of the pyramid builders is to realize just how distant their world is from ours. The monuments they raised have stood for thousands of years, enduring wind, sand, and time itself. But the human endurance that created them is something most of us today could scarcely imagine, let alone survive. The truth is, you wouldn't last a day building the pyramids, not because you lack willpower, but because modern life has softened us in ways the ancient world never allowed. Start with the sheer physical demands. Imagine waking before dawn, not to the comfort of an alarm clock and coffee, but to the call of an overseer's shout echoing through a crowded barrack. Your mattress is a mat of reeds, your neighbors pressed close, their sweat and snores your lullaby. Breakfast is not eggs or fruit, but coarse barley bread, gritty with sand from grinding stones, washed down with thick sour beer. Then, without pause, you march to the worksite where a 2-ton block waits, tied to a wooden sledge. Your task? Drag it forward with dozens of others, straining against ropes until your shoulders burn and your palms blister. The heat alone would undo most of us. By mid-morning, the desert sun blazes overhead, reflecting off limestone until the air itself seems to shimmer. Sweat pours into your eyes, your lips crack, your skin burns. Shade is almost non-existent, and water, though provided, never feels like enough. Dehydration creeps in, muscles seize, dizziness threatens. For the ancient workers, this was not a rare ordeal. It was every single day. They endured not with sunscreen and electrolyte drinks, but with grit, onions, and bread, their bodies hardened by a life without comforts. Then there is the monotony. Hour after hour, you repeat the same motions, pulling, hammering, lifting, chanting in rhythm with your crew. No variety, no distractions, just the same endless labor under the same unrelenting sun. Our modern world thrives on stimulation screens, music, conversation, but in the workers' world, there was only stone, dust, and the voice of your foreman urging you on. To us, boredom would be suffocating. To them, it was simply life. Injuries would claim many of us almost immediately. A rope burns through your skin, a hammerstone glances off your hand, or a block slips on the ramp, crushing your foot. Medical care, though advanced for its time, was still primitive by modern standards. Honey and herbs could treat wounds, but there were no antibiotics, no surgeries, no guarantees. To survive long enough to return to the ramp was luck as much as skill. For modern bodies, untrained and unused to constant strain, injury would be all but inevitable. Even the food, as sustaining as it was, would test our resolve. Imagine eating the same diet of coarse bread, onions, garlic, and beer day after day, with occasional fish or meat. No sugar, no coffee, no spices from distant lands, just the staples of survival, heavy and filling but monotonous. Your teeth grind down on the grit in the bread, wearing away enamel until chewing itself becomes painful. And yet, without this food, your body would collapse, unable to keep up with the punishing labor. Perhaps the hardest adjustment would be the absence of choice. For us, labor is tied to wages, to personal decision, to the idea that we can walk away if conditions grow too harsh. For the pyramid builders, there was no such freedom. Drafted by the state, summoned from villages during the Nile flood, they served because service was demanded. Refusal meant punishment, exile, or worse. Even for those who volunteered, pride and duty bound them to the work. For us, accustomed to personal autonomy, this loss of choice would feel suffocating, unbearable. And yet, for all this hardship, the workers endured. They found strength in camaraderie, chanting together as they hauled blocks, laughing together over bread and beer, carving graffiti into stones to leave their mark. They endured because their culture taught them that the pharaohs' eternity was tied to their own survival, that their labor was part of cosmic order, that each block was a prayer as much as a burden. Faith gave meaning to their sweat. Pride gave purpose to their pain. This is why you would not last a day. Not because you are weaker, but because your world has stripped away the very conditions that made such endurance possible. You live with comforts unimaginable to them: soft beds, climate control, medical care, endless variety in food. Your muscles are not hardened by constant toil, your mind not shaped by belief in divine kingship, your spirit not bound to communal duty in the same way. You are free, but in that freedom lies fragility. And yet, to admit you would not last a day is not to diminish them. On the contrary, it is to honor them. To stand before the pyramids today is to acknowledge that these monuments were not raised by slaves driven in misery, nor by machines, nor by miracles. They were raised by human beings, ordinary men whose strength, endurance, and faith carried stone upon stone until eternity took shape. They were tougher, more resilient, more bound to each other and their gods than most of us could ever be. So when you gaze at a pyramid, remember not only the pharaoh who commissioned it, but also the workers who made it real. Remember the hands that blistered, the backs that bent, the lives that were risked and lost. Remember that every gleaming stone was once dragged across the sand by men who endured hardships we cannot imagine. And remember, most of all, that you would not last a day in their place, not because you are less, but because they were extraordinary. And so, we come to the end of our long journey through the sands of ancient Egypt, walking step by step alongside the men who built the pyramids. We have seen their world not as silent monuments of stone, but as living worksites, quarries echoing with hammer strikes, ramps crowded with chanting crews, villages filled with the smell of bread and beer. We have felt the burning weight of the sun on their backs, the sting of rope in their palms, the exhaustion of endless days. We have glimpsed their suffering, their resilience, their bonds of brotherhood, and their faith in a vision that was greater than themselves. The pyramids that still rise above the desert are not only tombs for kings, they are testaments to ordinary human endurance. They remind us of lives spent in toil, of hands that shaped eternity, of sacrifices that outlasted memory. For us today, accustomed to comfort, it is almost unthinkable to endure what they faced. And yet they endured, and because of them, the pyramids still stand, dazzling reminders of what human beings can achieve when bound by duty, faith, and the stubborn will to create. If you've listened this far, I hope this story has not only helped you drift toward rest, but also filled your imagination with the sights and sounds of the ancient world. Before you go, please take a moment to subscribe to History for Sleep so you don't miss our next journey into the past. And let us know in the comments what parts of history you're most curious about, and when you like to listen, whether it's before bed, in the middle of the night, or during a quiet moment in the day. Your thoughts guide the stories we bring to life here. Now, as you close your eyes, picture the pyramid beneath the stars, its sides glowing faintly in the moonlight, eternal and silent. The chants of workers are gone, the ramps have crumbled away, but the stones remain, rising into the heavens. Let that image carry you gently into sleep, with the knowledge that the past is always there, waiting, ready to whisper its stories in the quiet of the night.